So I appreciate you taking the time. If you were somebody that completed the instructor evaluations early, that's great. If you completed them today, thank you for taking the time to do that. If you didn't have a device with you in order to complete today, I recommend that you try to do so by the end of this week before you get into finals week. Again, it's super helpful for me to know what's gone well in the course and some things that I can adjust and change. So I take that feedback seriously, and I really appreciate the work that you put in that regard. So thank you for doing that or having a plan to do that. Again, for next week's informal presentation, I just wanted to have some discussion points or ideas that you could share with the group in order to keep things a little bit light, but also help you feel prepared. Again, I'm not going to be grading on presentation quality or anything like that, just that you are attending, participating, and sharing the process for you. And again, because it's a day before the assignment is due, you might have your conversation recorded, but you might have some lingering questions about how to organize that or the concepts from the course that you might be bringing in and so on. As a reminder on Canvas, I created a running list of some of the terms that we've gone over since the midterm exam, which could definitely be ones that you apply and use in this final essay. And again, the rubric and an example outline is available to help you out too. So last class, we talked about sort of the dark side of communication, right? So some of the ways that interpersonal communication can be harmful. Yeah? Oh, yes. And I'll also have this available after class too, if you need additional time to be thinking through some of these. Yeah, no problem. So last class, we looked at some of the negative parts of communication and some of the ways that particularly in terms of romantic or intimate relationships, things such as lies, deception, and the idea of a test, right, of the relationship. For instance, throwing a wrench at the relationship or doing something hurtful to see if the relationship would last are some of the ways that we might deal with things like insecurity and anxiety as it relates to our relationships. So for this class, I want to get into some more elements of destructive communication. As a reminder, today by midnight is the deadline to turn in the extra credit, which adds 24 points or 2% onto your grade. I've already received a couple of them, but I'm asking you to integrate an outside article and explain some of the ways to connect to interpersonal communication. So some of you have done that already. It should be a prompt that you're able to see on Canvas. And again, that can help a lot of people who are on the border of a grade that they like. We'll share next Wednesday, and then that Thursday by midnight, please turn in your final essay. If you end up falling behind, I have to turn in grades by noon on the 20th and make sure that everybody is really regularly updated about your grades. So if you do need to turn it in late, please make sure that you have it in by the 19th at the latest. And then also, if you have remaining makeup assignments to do, I recommend getting those in, since that additional attendance credit could help you out a lot, especially if you're really close to a grade that you'd like. So we'll talk a little bit more about relational aggression and some of the ways that it can impact things, such as domestic violence. Again, this is more challenging stuff, so sort of as a content or trigger warning, right, we will be getting into discussions of domestic violence and related issues. So, one of the key ideas that we talked about last class, right, is that while we use interpersonal communication to build and bring people together, right, one of the challenges in terms of developing good skills for our own communication and dealing with the hazards that we encounter every day is thinking about how our communication can be hurtful and challenging. This is something that we've seen a lot of discussion about through things such as anti-bullying campaigns and public efforts to try to deal with aggression that we encounter every day, right? So when we say relational aggression, we don't just mean that somebody is physically hitting or attacking somebody, right? A lot of the ways that we experience aggression, bullying, and so on can involve strategies that aren't as direct too. So in this way, right, relational aggression is about hurting our relationships with other people, right, damaging their credibility, and things like that. That could be confrontational, right? So calling somebody a name, right? Making fun of them, as we see a lot right in middle and high school, the use of slurs or names to describe people. Cruel teasing, right, where you are making fun of somebody and they're the butt of the joke and they don't want to be. Ridicule, right, where you are constantly making fun of somebody. And then verbal rejection. So calling somebody a loser or refusing to let that person be a part of your group, or some of the ways that we could see a confrontational strategy at play. But there's also non-confrontational strategies, right? So spreading rumors or false information about somebody else in an effort to discredit them. If you've ever seen the film Mean Girls, right, it's a classic example of the way that rumors, gossip, and so on are spread, right? Gossip is oftentimes meant to harm, not only because it's inaccurate, but it's designed to spread sort of false or hurtful information about somebody else. And social manipulation, right, where you are trying to use other people for your own gain. So there's a lot of ways that we see these strategies play out too, and they would be defined as aggression. So again, Mean Girls is a classic example of how aggression is portrayed, right? When the film came out, it was in many ways meant to be a parody of a lot of high school type behavior, such as the use of cliques, of name calling, of insults. But, right, it was such a relatable, resonant experience for a lot of people growing up that, probably more so than the creators expected, it really tied to a lot of the challenges that we still encounter related to bullying and aggression. So among, right, young teens or preteens in particular, the use of gossiping, spreading rumors, and that type of thing is an especially common strategy. Again, if you've gone through kind of a middle school or junior high school experience, that can be an awful phase for dealing with challenges of verbal aggression because of the ways that we might not be comfortable directly expressing or sharing our concerns with other people. We might deal with our own process of developing an identity and sense of self, and we feel fear about other people. But one of the interesting trends is that as we move on toward college, we see more of a shift toward things such as venting, right, or talking negatively about somebody behind their back, minimizing role, right? So what that would mean is if you're participating in gossip or spreading a rumor, right, that you are saying, well, I didn't really add or contribute much to this. So trying to deflect blame. And then victim blaming, right, is another unfortunately common strategy that we tend to see as well, right, which is if somebody is hurt or impacted by bullying, right, we would hear phrases such as, well, they asked for it, as a way of trying to rationalize some of the experiences of bullying and aggression that we feel. Again, this is a persistent issue that we continue to encounter. So, one example of some of the ways that verbal aggression has been felt and experienced has been among members of the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, right? So that might include Asian Americans in the United States, but it can also include, right, populations of Asian or Pacific Islander descent from a lot of different countries, nationalities, and shared experiences. One of the challenges over this past year and a half is studies have found that there has been an increase of targeted bullying and attacks directed toward Asian and Pacific Islander people, right? For instance, right, if an Asian American family that's born in the United States and has, no kind of cultural or country-related relationship to COVID is growing up, they might be more likely to be targeted through targeted slurs or insults about responsibility for COVID-19, right? That's a trend. The Stop AAPI campaign, right, is an effort to try to mitigate and deal with those instances of targeted aggression and bullying that have been directed toward Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, right? And that's an example of showing how verbal aggression can be in many ways racialized and targeted towards specific populations in ways that at times can feel really disproportionate or unfair. So this idea of verbal aggression, right, of calling a human being a virus who would have no personal relationship to COVID-19, right, would be an example of attacking somebody's self-concept, their identity, as we've been talking about in the class, and the way that it develops over time to create the sort of psychological and social pain, right? Obviously, that creates a lot of problems for instance, the increase of things such as self-harm, the inability to feel involved in employment, and other forms of participation, right? Increased health issues, threat to somebody's own life. So those are some of the challenges that we can feel. One of the most classic examples, right, of verbal aggression is a character attack, also known as an ad hominem attack, right? So if you've taken like an argumentation or argumentative writing class, ad hominem is one of the most common logical fallacies, right, or arguments that just does not hold water. And an ad hominem is when you're attacking the person rather than attacking their argument. So if somebody says, you know, I really don't want to go out into town today because of the snow. Somebody says, well, I think you're stupid, right? You're not attacking that person's argument, you're just saying, oh, well, you're stupid, right? So that would be the use of a character attack. And again, that is so common when we think about like a lot of political and social debate and argumentation, right? And it's not limited to a single political party or side. I get really frustrated when that's an approach that's used instead of addressing the argument or underlying beliefs, right? Another issue is attacking somebody's competence. So again, I do a lot of research related to disability issues, and one of the things that I find frustrating is when somebody's competence is called into question as a way of saying or tying, right, somebody's identity to disability in a negative way. For instance, the way that somebody might say, oh, this person has dementia or schizophrenic, right? And again, we see this discussed around a whole range of identities and experiences. One of the consequences of that, right, is that it suggests that that person that's compared to is like a bad or a negative person, right? Whereas a lot of folks with disabilities, including, you know, dementia, autism, and so on, right, are dealing with a unique set of challenges and are human beings that don't necessarily enjoy being compared to in that type of way. A background attack, right, would be criticism of somebody's experience. So, for instance, in terms of providing support for students, faculty, and so on from international backgrounds, right, it would be offering support rather than attacking somebody on the basis of their life experience and where they came from. Physical appearance, right, is a big one, and that we oftentimes will see, again, targeted insults about somebody's appearance. Name calling, again, is something that we see a lot, especially in kind of middle and high school. Teasing, again, would be this repeated making fun of somebody, maybe trying to be joking or lighthearted, but that person not feeling like they were very validated by that experience. Ridicule, right, where you are making fun of somebody, oftentimes in a public way. The use of threats, as we talked about last class. Swearing, right, if it's directed at the person in a specifically derogatory way. And then the use of nonverbal communication, flipping somebody off, right, and something like road rage or that type of thing could also be the use of verbal aggression. So these are some pretty big ways that we see communication happening in a way that hurts others. One of the other challenges, and I think one of the important distinctions to make here, is to sort of disentangle bullying from verbal aggression. Because while it is verbal aggression, right, bullying is sort of its own thing. There have been a lot of campaigns and public efforts that have been trying to address bullying, right? I brought in the example of the AAPI youth campaign. I'll show a little clip from them in just a second. You might also think about in, right, the previous administration, there was a bullying campaign, right, that was trying to address issues of bullying, particularly cyberbullying, right? So bullying is unique from other forms of verbal aggression for two key reasons. First of all, it is related to power. If you think about a TV show or movie that has depicted a bully character, right? It's usually somebody that is strong, maybe somebody that's a junior or senior or super senior, right? Oftentimes a member of a sports team, right? We oftentimes associate that type of character with bully. Because that person has power, they're older, maybe they're more physically strong or fit, right? They have the ability to exert leverage or control over other people. So power is a pretty big part of this, right? And power can be not just in terms of physical strength, but it could also be the relationship between a supervisor and employee. If you wield some type of control or influence over somebody else, then that would fit the bill. It can include things such as physical bullying, right? Beating somebody up. Verbal bullying, such as issuing threats, ultimatums, and that type of thing. Or relational bullying, where you are trying to mess up somebody's relationships in order to hurt that person, right? So maybe you're concerned about somebody's friend and you decide to spread rumors about that friend so that the person is closer to you and you create distance between somebody you know and their friend, right? So that can be some of the ways that we see issues of bullying playing out. And I want to show, again, this example about some of the ways that recurrent cases of bullying have been addressed or dealt with as it relates to a lot of public youth campaigns.
May is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, a month where we celebrate the history, culture, and traditions of Asians and Pacific Islanders in the U.S. But at a time when the Asian community is fighting increasing harassment and hate, young voices are inspiring others to speak up. My 13-year-old daughter and a friend organized a rally in Shoreline this weekend to take a stand against racism, discrimination, and violence.
It was really inspiring and all the honks and thumbs up people gave. It felt really great and encouraging, and it really felt like I was making a difference because sometimes you can feel super alone. I think it's great in positive way to share my voice because sometimes I kind of I don't know how to.
Right, so we see a lot of examples of campaigns like that, particularly from younger folks, right, who are feeling some of the impacts of charge, again, on the basis of things like race, gender, and so on, forms of violence or bullying. So it's an ongoing discussion, an area where we can continue to apply interpersonal communication to many of these challenges. I definitely recommend taking Dr. Chen's intercultural communication course, if you haven't already, that gets into some of these issues in a lot more detail. So cyberbullying, right, is a change that we've seen over the past several years as a result of things like social media, right? And it's something that I think we've seen in a lot more magnified of a way as it relates to COVID-19, and particularly as not only more of our relationships moved online, but also more of our frustrations, anxieties, and fears moved online as well. In fact, while there's still ongoing research, there's pretty significant increases in cyberbullying across the board that we've noticed in this past year and a half. So, right, cyberbullying is not just the use of electronics to insult or make fun of somebody, but it's the way that that's used in a repeated way over time, right? So one of the ways that this might happen would be using things such as TikToks, the use of social media and circulation in order to share embarrassing photos or videos of somebody else, right? That's one way that cyberbullying can happen. But it can also be, the use of things such as repeated attacks through messages, through trolling, right, and other ways that are designed to hurt somebody else. So again, that's something that we've seen a lot more commonly, especially as we've transitioned online. And, right, there's still kind of mixed understanding of whether or not cyberbullying has a more negative psychological impact on people than bullying that happens face-to-face. So it's an ongoing area to try to think about and work on. So if you've seen, again, shows like The Office, oftentimes, right, Played for Laughs, we'll see instances of workplace-related bullying. Again, workplace communication is something we talked about a bit on Monday, and some of the biggest ways that we would see bullying relate to power, right, and relate to the relationship between a supervisor and an employee. And so there's a lot of ways that we could encounter some negative experiences, and again, see these relationships depicted on screen. Isolation and exclusion is a big one, right? So an employer might cause an employee to feel like they're on their own or they don't have opportunities to be supported. Another issue is the use of intimidation or threats, right? Saying, come to the office today or you're going to get fired, right? Or saying, hey, we have a shift to cover, you need to go to the office or else. The use of verbal threats, right? Again, could more specifically say what would happen if you didn't comply. Damaging professional identity is one of the more challenging ways that this is used, right? For a lot of jobs, something like a letter of recommendation or reference might be required. So somebody might say, well, you know, I sure wouldn't want to write a bad reference for you, and that could be used in a hurtful way. Limiting career opportunities, right, and saying, for instance, a supervisor might choose on bases including gender and race not to provide opportunities towards specific employees. That can be a problem. Getting in the way of work, and also getting in the way of things like work-life balance, right? So if a job has a very defined period that you work, and people are calling or reaching out to you well outside of what would be reasonable, that can be one major problem. And then the denial of due process and natural justice, right? This is a big issue, especially when we look at Title IX, right, which deals with cases of discrimination on the basis of sex, right? You might recall the few years ago, right, the Penn State case, child abuse, and in that situation, you had a coach who was deliberately trying to cover up and prevent the formal procedures and criminal proceedings from happening, right? So oftentimes there's an effort to cover tracks as it happens in a lot of these workplace scenarios that can be incredibly harming for people that are surviving or dealing with bullying. So there's a quadrant of ways that we can think about how aggression, including bullying, cyberbullying, verbal, nonverbal forms, can be dealt with, right? And these fit under aggression, assertion, passive aggression, and a passive approach. And you can think about these based on how open communication is and how much we seem to care about the other person. For instance, the person that's bullying or hurting us, right? If somebody is aggressive, they don't really care about the other person, but you want to be really open about how they feel. So if somebody calls you a name and you choose to call a name back at them, right, that would be the use of an aggressive approach. It's not that you really care about the relationship, it's that you respond to fire with fire. Assertion, right, means that yes, you're open, but you also care about other people. So if somebody calls you a name and you say, hey, I really don't appreciate when you insult me in that way and call me that name, let's work on a solution, right? You're sharing your needs, but also trying to do so in a way that's constructive. And again, there's not in every situation are you going to encounter another person that's willing to be open to that, right? If somebody calls you a name as you're driving and you try to initiate that conversation with them, there's a fear that that other person isn't really going to care, right? Passive aggression means that you neither really care about the other person, nor do you offer very open communication either, right? If you think about what the purpose of passive aggression is, it's not really to assert your needs or concerns, and it's not really to be clear to the other person about what it is that's bothering you. So passive aggression might be muttering under your breath or saying something like, oh, I haven't heard that name before, right? It's not really offering a commitment to the other person about what's bothering you, nor is it showing a lot of care for that other person in disclosing your feelings. And then a passive approach, right, would be caring about the other person, but choosing not to be open or care a lot about yourself, right? This could also be considered an avoidant approach, where somebody is insulting or making fun of you, and maybe you just like laugh along or physically leave the situation. And one of the challenges when it comes to things like aggression and bullying, right, is the potential for violence, the role that power plays and so on. So when we're thinking about this quadrant of approaches, it's not that there's one that's a one-size-fits-all best, right? In some situations, including in situations of domestic violence, a passive approach might be necessary for things such as safety. So there's a lot of different ways these approaches might be seen differently depending on the situation. Another key idea here, and something that we teased out a little bit last class, is the role of deception in our relationships, right? So deception is focused on the idea that we want somebody to believe the wrong conclusions. I brought up last class the idea of gaslighting, right? Of causing somebody to question their senses, where you might say something and then go back and say, oh, I didn't say anything at all. And you're causing that person to be uncertain of how they understood an event. Again, The term, I think, gets used a lot in a way that's kind of buzzwordy, but it is this intentional focus on trying to get somebody to doubt their senses. So if somebody said something and then later forgot that they said it and genuinely didn't remember, right? That wouldn't necessarily be gaslighting because it's not focused on the intentional effort to make somebody doubt their emotions. Falsification would be providing just incorrect information about somebody else, right? So falsification is showing something like a fake ID at a bar, right? It's providing that wrong information in a very specific way. Concealment would be hiding really important details. So for instance, right, if somebody just got fired from a job and the other person, like a parent or family member, says, hey, how was your day? And you say, it's good, things went well. And you're choosing not to share the detail that you got fired, right? You'd be concealing that detail. Because it'd be pertinent and important to share, but there's a choice not to do it. And then equivocation. So this is especially common when it comes to, again, political speak. It's something that's not really a lie, but is something you might consider to be double speak, right? It's misleading and causes somebody to reach the wrong conclusion. So that could be, again, the use of something like logical fallacy. 2 is a number, and 1 is a number, right? So 2 is 1, right? That has a gap there because it's making a logical conclusion that doesn't match with what we would define 2 and 1 as, right? In the same way, you might say, and this could be a part of relational maintenance, right? Somebody says, how was my dinner? You might say, oh, well, and they made really bad food. You might say, well, it was a dinner, or that was a lot of food, right? In an effort to not directly respond to the question and to say something that's technically true. We might do that to save face and manage our relationships every day. So one of the ideas brought up earlier in the quarter was from Dr. Stella King-Toomey, who talked about the idea of face negotiation theory, right? The idea that we have a face or a public persona that we share with other people, and that we do this idea of face work every day where we try to maintain good relationships with other people. You might also think about it as reputation, right? How do you manage your reputation within something like your team, your work, your family, and so on. So there are some reasons that we might lie, and lying can run on the spectrum from a white lie to an incredibly damaging or hurtful lie. We do so to manage our relationships. Again, we care about somebody, but they made bad food, and we don't want to hurt their feelings. We manage our face needs. In other words, maybe we mentioned that we had a really rough time going to work through the snow, but we don't want other people to know that, so we say, oh, things went okay. You might think back to a dialogical tension. What is an example, or what is dialectical tension? This is something that we talked about when we were thinking about friendship and other relationships. I know this is the last day and a lot of you are pretty exhausted, so dialectical tension. Could think about an example of this too.
Would that be kind of like the elephant in the room?
That could be one way of dealing with dialectical tension, yeah. So dialectical tension deals with sort of 2 extremes, right? So you might think about that in a relationship, we want both closeness and independence, right? It's dialectical, there's 2 extremes, and we're feeling this push-pull in either direction. So we might lie to somebody, for instance, we want a little bit of distance in our relationship and say, sorry, I'm busy tonight, I can't go out. Even if you could, you're doing so as a way to deal with that tension by choosing to spend more time on your own, right? So that's one example, right, of a dialectical tension of openness and independence versus closeness. You might think about some other examples that we've been going over, such as the tension between privacy and disclosure, ideal and real, how we want a relationship to be versus how it is. So we might be willing to lie in an effort to maintain good relationships with others. We might use it for control, right, to try to manage the relationship and direct how somebody else should feel. We might continue a previous deception, right? So lies have a tendency to snowball over time. And there might be other reasons, right? There's been research into why it is that we lie, but still some work that we need to do to better understand what motivates us to do that, right? For instance, the use of pathological lying is an issue here. Domestic violence is an incredibly important and challenging issue to deal with. I want to direct that, Eastern Oregon University has the Title IX office. So whenever there's an issue of domestic violence, right, that either you've experienced or that you have witnessed, right, as a reporter, you can contact either the Privileged Campus Advocate, who is a direct resource that's hired to support students in cases like this, and the Title IX coordinator, who will be able to deal with issues of discrimination, including on the basis of sex. So I wanted to explain, and again, reference these resources here about the ways that we can actively respond to and deal with these challenges on campus, right? Because they do happen. Domestic violence, right, is a lot of different areas, including intimidation, right, physical assault, battery, sexual assault, or other abusive behaviors. It's part of control, right? It can include things like sexual violence, stalking, physical violence, psychological aggression. So it covers a very broad range of behaviors. And it's an issue that we see talked about a lot, right? For instance, in the United States, domestic violence is estimated to impact 1 in 4 women, 1 in 10 men. For folks that might be non-binary, right, those numbers are also very high, but there's been less work to understand those numbers too. So it's an issue that we see a lot, right? It's an issue that comes out a lot, and it's an issue where concerns surrounding trust and the ability for somebody to be believed when those situations happen is an area that we're continuing to try to work on as a culture. So one of the most important ideas here when it comes to domestic violence, right, is addressing the issue of victim blaming, right? That the person experiencing violence is not necessarily the person responsible for that violence, right? But when it comes to addressing domestic violence, right, it means not only that the person, the victim or survivor, is dealing with resources and might reach out to resources if they're comfortable, but probably the best way, right, of dealing with domestic violence and aggression is for the aggressor or person themselves to fix and stop their behavior, right? And so there's been a lot of research in psychology and sociology that's dealt with trying to understand why things like domestic violence happen. Again, it's the idea, and this can be generational. Again, my family background was in psychology and sociology, and we saw cycles, right? The parents were hurtful or abusive to children, and then the children were hurtful and abusive too. Oftentimes, domestic violence comes from the belief that using things like power and using violence to hurt other people is a constructive way to deal with and solve a conflict, right? That it can solve the problem. And sometimes there might be an immediate short-term gratification if violence causes somebody else to shut down. Reconciliation and apology, though, is a more useful way to, of course, deal with the long-term challenges that might come from conflict. And it's found that it's much more useful and helpful to deal with that in the earlier stages of conflict. So the further something escalates, right, the wires are not cut early, it's a lot harder for somebody when their feelings have been rising up to take efforts to resolve and deal with these types of challenges. So again, just I think some important information here. So I know we're kind of at the end of class, so I'm not going to ask you to break off to do this, but I do want us to think about, one major question might be some of the ways that face-to-face and cyberbullying could be felt differently, right? So face-to-face bullying, of course, has this direct experience on people. They feel like a lot of senses and affect in how they experience and address violence. So that can be one major way that that's different. Cyberbullying, right, doesn't necessarily involve as many senses. You might think about things like social information processing theory and the idea that, when something is more rich and it involves more of our senses, like, our sense of touch, taste, smell, and so on, right? It can be a bigger experience, but cyberbullying tends to be something that follows us for a longer period of time. It can happen through things such as texting, through circulation on social media, and so on. So one of the ways that cyberbullying can be more challenging is that it's not limited to your interaction with that person, right? It spreads, and it's something you can feel in a lot of situations. And then the other issue, right, is thinking about the role that social media has had on bullying. So the idea that, again, social media means that a lot of hurtful messages, the use of video, photo, and so on can be spread a lot more rapidly and reach a much larger group of people. So social media has definitely had a pretty big impact on these issues too. Again, I know that this is a little bit dark, but I do think that knowing some of these issues and challenges related to interpersonal communication is a way that empowers us to deal with some of these conflicts that can happen. So some of the major things that we went over today, we're talking about relational aggression, some of the ways that we specifically can hurt other people, the use of bullying, right, which is this very targeted effort, including the basis of race, as we've seen in a lot of targeted bullying related to COVID-19 and Asian and Pacific Islander people. And then the challenges of things like domestic violence, and we've also gone over some of the resources and opportunities that are available in trying to deal with and address some of these issues. So again, as a reminder, our final meeting for the class, which will be a lot more on a lighter note, is 8 to 10 next Wednesday. Again, that's an hour early. So if you can't make it, just let me know and I'll send along a Zoom link and project you on screen. And then if you can't do either of those things, then upload a short 4 to 5 minute video and share that with me. Again, I'm not asking for a big presentation. I think it's just a really great opportunity for us to share our thoughts, our ideas, our progress toward this paper, and just to reflect on how the conversation we had with that other person went. So again, I find it's a nice way to end the quarter, especially if you're dealing with some major final exams in your other classes. So that's the big thing to work on, is continuing the essay, completing the extra credit by the end of the day, completing the instructor evaluations if you were not able to do so today, and preparing as we get close to the finish line. So, I'm rooting for you in a successful remainder of your quarter. I'll be available for office hours, 10 a.m. till noon today, either through Zoom or in Ackerman, so please reach out to me if you need additional support. Please pass forward your attendance activity for today. Have a great Friday and a great time surviving this snowy weather, and I look forward to seeing you next Wednesday.